Hello, I'm Jeff Boyd from elementarywave.com. This video is about hope. Despite the rising tide of illness that keeps us socially isolated. When this started, many people assumed that it would go away in about 2 weeks. Every week, reality is becoming more nightmarish than it was. I am an MD, physician, and trained epidemiologist. This video will give you a blunt, unvarnished appraisal of how I am thinking about my own future. I am 76 years old, although my patients all say I look much younger. And I have mild heart disease and high blood pressure, so my risk of dying are increased over the average person. In 1918, a virus living in birds jumped into the human species and began causing a pandemic. The first year was terrible, but then it came back a second year, and then it was much worse. 25 million people died. We're not sure of the death rate out of 100 infected people, but it's reasonable to assume that it was 1% or higher. In 2019, a virus living in some other species, probably bats, jumped into the human species and began causing a pandemic. The death rate is 1% or more. Now, some people say, well, a death rate of 1%, that's no worse than the common flu. What they don't recognize is that the death rate is not the problem. The problem is that every time you blink your eyes, the number of people infected doubles. It is essential for you to understand what the words exponential growth mean. There's a legend that there was a man who owed a king some money he couldn't repay, so the king said, well, look, I will be merciful. Here's a checkerboard with 64 squares. You can repay me in rice. All you have to do is put 1 grain of rice on the first square, and then the next day put 2 grains of rice on the second square, and then the next day put 4 grains of rice on the third square, doubling the number of grains of rice every square. The man said, "Oh, thank you, King, for being so merciful." What is wrong with this story? What is wrong is exponential growth. Before the man could put rice on the last square, 64th square, he was required to put down 9 billion grains of rice. That is more rice than has ever been grown on Earth in the entire history of humanity. If the grains of rice were people infected, then just after half of the checkerboard, more people would be infected than the entire population of the Earth. Think about what I just said. If one person was infected with a virus on day 1, and it grew exponentially, then by 1 month, the entire population of the Earth could be infected. That's what exponential growth means. It is not the 1% death rate that is our problem. It is the exponential growth, which results in something called the surge. The surge means that there's a tidal wave of people who are deathly ill about 3 weeks after they get the virus. Of those who come down with this disease, the great majority of them, perhaps 85%, have a mild case and do well, which is great. The problem is that some percentage have a severe infection. Perhaps they have trouble breathing and they need to be in a hospital. What happens if the number of people in that surge, that tidal wave, exceeds the number of hospital beds, nurses and doctors, etc.? Well, it's a terrible situation. They faced that terrible situation in Italy. They had more people needing hospitalization than they could hospitalize, and they were forced to make a decision at the front door to say that everyone aged 60 and above could not get in the hospital. If you come to the hospital deathly ill and you're over the age of 60, you are told to go home. If you're going to die, die at home. As someone aged 76, that sounds pretty bad to me, but I believe that it is the most ethical decision that could be made under that terrible circumstance. Among all the bad decisions, it is the least bad. The best idea would be if we never faced that decision. And the only way to avoid that decision is to slow down the rate of exponential growth so that we move from one square on the checkerboard to the next square in more than 2 days. If we doubled the number of infected people every 4 days or 6 days or 8 days, then there might be hope for someone 76 years old like me. We can learn from history. In 1918, the health commissioner in the city of St. Louis closed down the city, closed down all public gatherings, and required social isolation, and the death rate in that city was relatively low. In the city of Philadelphia, the health commissioner said, well, this is no worse than the common flu. And he allowed there to go on a great parade celebrating the end of World War I. Within 3 days, all 31 hospitals in Philadelphia were full, and within a week, thousands and thousands of people in Philadelphia were dead. When your enemy is growing exponentially, you have to make very fast decisions, or things get completely out of control. I consider the man who's repaying the king with grains of rice on the checkerboard. That man would have been better off if he refused to pay anymore after 11 days when he had to put down 1,000 grains of rice, versus if he'd waited until 12 days when he had to put down 2,000 grains of rice, versus if he waited until 13 days when he had to put down 4,000 grains of rice. So let's say you're indecisive and you need to have a committee meeting to get all the stakeholders to buy into this idea of not repaying the debt to your king at 1,000 grains of rice. So you hold a committee meeting, and it's the 17th day before you come up with a decision to no longer pay the king. How much do you owe him then on the 17th day? You owe him not 1,000 grains of rice. You owe him 65,000 grains of rice. The problem, the tyranny of exponential growth, is due to arithmetic. Now you may hate what I'm saying, but I did not make up the rules of arithmetic. Now, I am a psychiatrist, and now I'm going to tell you something that is so important for your mental health, more important than anything Sigmund Freud ever said, something that psychiatrists are not supposed to say out loud, and so I'm going to whisper it in your ear. The only people who are sane today are those who are paranoid. I'll bet you never heard a psychiatrist saying anything like that before. It's too honest. Now I figure eventually I will get infected. What happened in 1918 is all the people who could get infected got infected. When I get it, I will then spin the dice and discover whether it is my fate to die or to live. But I would rather spin the dice when the hospitals have some way of treating me if I get deathly ill. Long story short, I plan to stay very socially isolated until at least September 2020. Times like these make me think about my death, and I need to make peace with death. Making peace with death is the same thing as making peace with life. If you read the history of epidemics and plagues in the past, you'll find that religion helped a lot of people, and it helps me also. Many viewers would prefer the word spirituality, and that's an excellent word also. What it comes down to is, what is life all about? And ironically, about the best role model you and I have for what life is all about is from those who are risking their lives every day in the hospitals treating sick people, namely the nurses and doctors. This is Jeff Boyd from elementarywave.com. Keep safe, and I will see you on the other side.